friends, and welcome back. I'm Shannon Makes, and this is the behind the seams video for my corset hoodie, which was released last week. If you haven't somehow seen that video, I highly recommend to go watch that before you start in on this one. Everything will make so much more sense. So the purpose of this video is not going to be some fancy montage make type video, but it's going to be a more cozy, casual sit down and chat where I talk about more of the details of making this corset. So perhaps you yourself are interested in making one and you'd like a little bit more information than was given in the original video. This is for you. Hello friends, timeout, editing Shannon here, just popping in quickly to mention something that I forgot to say earlier, which is that there have been several people in the comments saying that they would like to make their own version of a corset hoodie. So I would like to float the idea of maybe doing a sew along sometime in January. I haven't fleshed out the details yet, but if you're interested in some sort of corset hoodie sew along early in the next year, sound off in the comments, let me know, and maybe we can make something happen. Additionally, I did want to address one other thing, and that was the comments from people who said that they did want to sew on, but that they didn't have access to a serger. And I want to say that it is not necessary to have a serger to sew this garment. I know that I serged my edges in the video, but in pretty much every case, I sewed the seam first with a normal machine and then just used the serger to clean up the raw edges. But within the seam allowance, I'd already sewn. So all of the outermost stitches, the ones that are like forming the shape of the corset that you're seeing here, are the ones from the straight stitch machine. It is a stretchy knit fabric that I'm using, but the garment itself is not a stretchy garment. It doesn't need to stretch, and in fact it probably shouldn't stretch because the bottom, you want it to hold that corsety shape, whereas the top is so loose that it shouldn't be stretching. There should be no pressure on it. So if you don't have a serger, you can still sew a hoodie like this. Most normal knit sweatshirt fleece fabrics should be just fine. All right, back to where I was. So to start with, I figured I would talk about the patterns that I used, the free mood patterns, and whether I liked them, what I liked, what I didn't like, that sort of thing. So first of all, I will say that they are free and they are pretty darn size inclusive, which are two great points to start off with. There are definitely some downsides though, and I will say one of them is that having so many sizes on one pattern does mean that there are certain points, as is the case on many sewing patterns, where it's really hard to tell which line is your line when you're cutting it out. It's a pretty minor issue, and like I said, it's very common with other sewing patterns as well, but something to keep in mind. I will say that the sizing definitely seemed questionable on the Briar top. So if I go in and I look at the size measurements, according to their size chart, if I go by my bust measurement, I should be a 4 or a 6. If I go by my hips, I should be a 2. And if I go by my waist, I should be a 10. However, I ended up needing to cut out a size 18 to get this to fit. So I'm not sure what's going on with that. I will say definitely when you cut your pattern out, like take a look at the panels, kind of hold them up to your torso and see if they look like they're even vaguely the right size, because I at least definitely had some minor issues with that. The other issue I had with the Briar top pattern is that the instructions for the end are completely non-existent. They literally, the instructions are online only. You can go online, look at the instructions, you'll see what I mean. They literally just stop. They don't tell you how to close the back panel or how to set in the grommets, anything like that. It wasn't a big deal for me because I was already going a little bit off script at that point anyway. Plus, I'm very comfortable with sewing and I know how to set my own grommets and I can figure out how to close the back up myself, but it did seem a little bit weird. I think there's something going on there. So just be prepared that the end of the sewing process, you will have exactly 0 guidelines. And then the one other tiny little thing that I do wish Mood had done is that they don't mark where to put these grommets on the hood pattern. They just tell you like, oh, approximately here. Can you just give me a mark on the pattern so I know where to put it? It would have saved me like maybe only 5 minutes, but is it that hard? Just put a little mark. So moving on to the Franken patterning, combining these two patterns into one process. First of all, I would definitely recommend doing a mock-up at least of the torso corset section, because I, as I already described, did have some sizing issues in terms of just getting it around my torso, but also I ended up adding about 1.25 inches of height because they were very short pattern pieces. And even with that 1.25 inches I added, I could actually have gone even a further inch beyond that, and it still would have been quite comfortable and fit me very well. I don't even have an extremely long torso. I would have said that I'm fairly short torsoed, so definitely look, maybe you want to add a little bit of length onto your panels as well. And a good way to get a feel for that is I just took my pattern pieces and held them up to my body and saw right away that I thought probably could use a little bit of extra length. So you don't need to go all the way into the mock-up process. You can actually right off the bat just kind of eyeball it, and that might give you a good idea if you want to add some length or not. Then maybe check out the waspy shape of the corset, see if you want to make it slightly more pronounced, which is what I did in the end, and I quite like the effect. I think it could have been even slightly more exaggerated, but then again, I didn't bone this middle point, so maybe it's a good thing that I didn't go too far. Then, like I mentioned, joining the two was not quite as simple as simply slapping the torso hoodie part of the Gordonia pattern onto the briar bottom, because they have very different arms, eyes, and shoulder shaping. So that was definitely an interesting process. And if you're not feeling 100% comfortable in terms of how exactly to add them two together, I could actually recommend an easier way to go about it would be to keep the pattern from the briar top, keep the arm's eye, keep the sleeve from the briar top, and just make that sleeve a full-length sleeve. So you could take the sleeve pattern from the hoodie and use it to sort of guide how much you want to extend the sleeve from the briar top pattern. And that way you could just keep the entire torso, keep the sleeve, everything that belongs to the briar top pattern, you just keep it, and then you just lengthen out the sleeve, add the little cuff, and then you can measure the neckline and print out a hoodie. Now the nice thing about the hoodie is it has this cute little overlap in the front here, so you've got some wiggle room. Hoodies aren't particularly fitted garments anyway, so just measure around your neckline, see what circumference that ended up being based on the briar top, and then measure that out on your hoodie pattern and see which size hood to choose. And if in doubt, just err on the side of being a little bit too big, and it's fine, it'll just overlap slightly more. And then lastly, if you do decide to kind of do what I did, and that is to combine the two patterns into one, you will almost definitely have to slash and spread the top of the Gordonia hoodie to add a bit of width here, because those shoulders are much narrower compared to the shoulders on the briar top. But as you can see, it turned out pretty well. My shoulder seam is sitting right here, which is like just a little bit farther down my arm than a normal shoulder sleeve would sit. And it's kind of a slouchy, comfortable garment anyway, so that totally works. I have no issue with that whatsoever. Next, moving into the construction, I followed the instructions for the briar top, more or less, and by that I mean to say that I completely disregarded the instructions for the hoodie. I didn't use those at all. I relied mainly on the instructions for the briar top, obviously going slightly off script to do a few things differently, and then making up my own ending because their pattern didn't have an ending, but that's to say you don't really need the instructions for the hoodie. Sewing the corset section was actually incredibly straightforward and very simple. Like I mentioned, I did think about whether I should add a boning channel in the center front just to keep the point of the bottom of the V like nice and rigid. In the end, I didn't use it and it worked out totally fine for me. But if you are going to exaggerate that V shape even more, you might want to consider adding a boning channel right in the center front. Then sandwiching the hoodie top in between the inner and outer layers of the corset bodice worked really well. It is super clean. I will say I did differ from the instructions a little bit here. The instructions have you sew it all kind of in one step. So you pin it together and you sew the sandwich all in one go, the fashion fabric, the bodice, and then the lining fabric. And I didn't do it that way because I wanted to add my boning in at the very end. So what I did was I just sewed the outer layer to the top first, so that was all settled in, and then I went back and added the lining. And when I sewed it there, I didn't sew it fully closed. Like I said, I left those little gaps to go back and insert the boning afterwards, and that worked really well. So I definitely recommend doing that. You could theoretically leave the gaps at the bottom of the corset instead to put your boning in from the bottom, but then you're gonna have some issues with the order of operations if you want to add binding to that bottom edge. While we're on the topic of lining, I thought I should mention that I am really happy that I switched mine out for this thinner cotton. Not only was it just much nicer aesthetically, but it did have some additional benefits that I actually didn't foresee, but I'm really glad that it worked out that way. Because as it turns out, this morning when I was preparing for this video, I actually came across this fabric, and it is sort of a stretchy knit fabric in a very similar shade. And I remember now I actually picked it up thinking I might use it for the cuffs. I obviously didn't, but I could have, if I had come across this a couple days earlier, I could have used this for the inside lining layer, but I don't actually think that that would have been the best choice. So my thoughts on the situation are that the cotton actually adds a nice structure to the garment. It keeps the outer layer of the corset from overly stretching out over time, and it just adds a nice little rigidity and some extra structure for holding the embroidery threads of the flossing. The downside is that that makes the garment a little more rigid and therefore a little bit more annoying to put on and off. And I will talk about that in the next section, which is the wearability of this garment. But basically, I think you should consider if you prefer a garment that's a little bit like more structured and stable, or if you want to go more away from the corset aspect and more into the comfort, in which case something like the knit lining might be the way to go for you. Next up, the armhole area. I will admit it was a little bit funky. I sewed it following the instructions for the mood pattern, and I did it mostly by machine, but in the end I did have to go back and just do a little bit of fine detail work by hand, because there are some really tight corners in there between where the shoulder ends and then where the bodice of the corset part starts, and there were like just tiny little holes that I didn't really feel comfortable sewing with my machine. Just had so much more control with hand stitching. So heads up that you might have to go in and do a little bit of hand stitching, or just be prepared to go really slow with your machine. On the plus side, the hoodie construction is super simple and straightforward. Inserting the sleeves with the rest of the garment flat was very easy. I did still run 2 lines of gathering stitches because you do still have to ease the sleeve in a little bit. Just match up the notches and use your gathering threads to do that bit of easing, and then it's super simple. The hood also likewise, apart from the fact that I wish they would have marked where the grommets were, the hood also was very easy. I just sewed them together and then folded the edge under so that I could run a drawstring, which in the end I didn't end up inserting because I don't have one that's long enough, and I don't really use the drawstrings anyway. They always kind of just end up being a hassle in the wash for me personally. So, but I have the grommets. If I want to add one later, I can. About the flossing specifically, I don't really have a ton of tips on this one because it was my first time flossing a garment. I will say that Lena Piprick has a fantastic video about making a flossing sampler, and it has lots of tips and tricks and tons of different flossing patterns. I did not actually have time to go and watch it all because it is an hour-long video, so I just completely winged it, and it turned out pretty cute, although I did definitely do a little bit of research and found a historically inspired flossing pattern. The one tip I can say is I actually made a little template here. And so I used this to make sure that the flossing on all of my different bones stayed the same and they were all, you know, looking fairly equal. And as it turns out that my chalk pencil does not actually mark very well on my sweatshirt fabric. So I did, instead of using chalk to mark it, I did go in and use pins instead to mark the heights. But beyond that, don't really have any tips. Just go for it, have fun. If you're a little bit nervous about it, just do a little sampler first. I will say about the flossing, I do love the personalized, unique, and historic touch that it gives. Plus, I do genuinely think it will contribute to the longevity of the garment because it will keep those bones from shifting around and poking through what is admittedly pretty thin, fragile fabric. And I definitely didn't want to interface it to make it more sturdy because then you kind of lose the slouchy comfort aspect of it. So I do recommend flossing. It's kind of fun and I think it's going to make your garment last longer. So talking about wearability, how wearable is this garment? Because of course you see people on YouTube make garments all the time and then sometimes they wear them on a regular basis and sometimes you never see them again and they look really cute and pretty, but you're like, is that really practical to wear? So here are my thoughts on that. First off, it goes on and off pretty easily. Not as easily as a normal sweatshirt, but still fairly easily. What I will say though is that if you are somebody who has trouble regulating your own temperature, if temperature control is an issue for you, or you're someone who throughout the day likes to have like a zippered sweatshirt that you can kind of adjust depending on your surroundings, this might not be the garment for you, or you might want to think about doing the zippered version like I showed in the original video where there's a zipper down the center front, because it takes enough time to get on and off that you probably wouldn't want to be doing that if you're constantly needing to change the temperature of your clothing to adjust for your setting. On the other hand, it does keep your torso nice and toasty, which definitely is good if you're living in a cold climate, which I currently am, or if you are someone who has back pain sometimes, like I actually do. I do get an achy back every now and then. I have a back warmer that I do sometimes wear just for keeping it nice and warm, and this does a fantastic job at that. So if that's a highlight, a bonus for you, definitely consider making one of these. So what I've been doing to wear this is I lace it up ahead of time. I use like a set about 2-inch lacing gap and I keep it laced and pull it on laced, and it's fairly easy to get on over my head. But then when I want to take it off, then I untie the laces and just let them hang quite loose and probably about halfway unlaced, and then it comes off much easier than if I try to like wiggle out of it while it's still laced up. I will say I am planning on buying one of those plastic drawstring toggles, and I think that that's gonna make getting in and out of this much easier because I can just like slide it loose instead of letting the laces come completely undone. So do consider maybe adding one of those toggles to this. About the laces that I myself am using, I am currently using these. They are, I would say, roughly 2mm round elastic cords, and I would definitely recommend using round cords. You could go much thicker. You could easily go maybe 3, 4, 5 mil, no problem, but I will say that the round ones work much better than the flat ones. When I was lacing this up with my lacing strips, which use the same exact grommets as these, I was using some flat elastic, and it was really annoying to sort of do any adjusting with those laces. So definitely would recommend using round cording if you can get your hands on it. And lastly, a few miscellaneous thoughts. First off is the binding. It was not originally in my plan to add binding to this. It was very much a spur of the moment addition, but I'm super glad that I did it because I absolutely love it. I think it really gives like a nice finished look to the garment. That bottom edge was looking a little bit naked and plain beforehand, and this really kind of made it look a little bit more classy, a little bit more dressed up. Plus, it's nice that it has a bit of the like historic touch to it. I was worried that it was gonna add maybe too much bulk, so I almost didn't do it, but in the end, it's not a problem. It really definitely 100% worth it in my personal opinion. Maybe on the next one that I do, I will try and bind the top edge as well. I do think I've seen one example that had both edges bound, and that also looks pretty classy, so maybe I'll try and figure out a way to do that on my next one. Who knows? A few people in the comments have mentioned that they could envision this as a full-out dress, which I think is a super interesting idea. And if you do decide to do this, please share your photos with me because I find this idea absolutely fascinating. For me, I'm thinking it might be more versatile to have a skirt and a hoodie so that I can mix and match. But as one of you actually thoughtfully pointed out in a separate video, versatility means different things for different people. And for some of you, versatility might mean that having a one garment that you can put on instead of multiple garments is actually definitely a benefit. So please, if you make this into a dress, share the photos. I would love to see them. Speaking of that, my new goal now is to start a trend of homemade corset hoodie clad sewists. So if you decide to tackle this project yourself and make a corset hoodie, please share the pictures with me on Instagram, on Reddit, wherever you can get a hold of me. You can message me on Coffee. I want to see these photos. Maybe let's use the hashtag corset hoodie crew so we can all find each other. I will try to share these images on Instagram. And I think that let's try to encourage as many people as possible to make one of these rather than shipping it all the way from China, you know, just to have it probably disintegrate in a few weeks. So leave me a comment below if you think you are gonna tackle this project, if you found this video helpful, what your favorite aspect of this garment is, how you would modify it to fit your specific needs. Go ahead and just leave me something fun to read in the comments below because that's always the highlight of doing these videos, is reading your guys' feedback. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I will catch you in the next video.